Hello ladies and gentlemen, again I'm going to show you on this video tutorial something else, something new. Why? Because I want to show you everything from this project. So for this video tutorial I'm going to explain you how to paint leather, how to paint wood, and how to paint the hair. So for this the technique will be more or less similar because we will paint with texture. Sometimes with stippling. I know you know this technique, the stippling. The idea is just paint with some layers like dots and some layers like scratches or lines. Something like that, something easy. And what do you have to create or make? The idea will be make something abstract to represent the material. That means sometimes you can start exactly with the same process, with the same colors maybe, but the most important will be that you have to finish with something different. For example, if you're painting leather, something like a tip I can give you will be paint with inks at the end or with a glossy varnish. Why? To have a glossy finish, okay? So this finish will be different than another material, only because you painted something with the same technique, the same stippling, the same dots, the same everything, and the result looks flat. So then if you use the same technique, the same stippling, and then you use inks, you will create another different material. This is the first tip I can give you on this video tutorial. So if you see now, I'm painting everything with stippling, but I try to start at the beginning with something like a big brush, something thicker, to paint these dots, this stippling, and then with the next layers, next brushes, paint thinner and thinner and thinner to have something more interesting with just playing with the sides of every dot. Okay, for example, if you want to paint the wood, I recommend you start you can start with the same technique, the same process, but then I recommend you finish this with something different. For example, if the leather will have a perfect edge highlights, on the wood, I recommend you this shoulder pad wood, I recommend you paint the edge highlights with dots too. Why? Because you want to represent something made from this elf. Because if everything looks clean, everything looks perfect at the end, you try to tell that everything was made from a factory, and maybe will look weird for that model, or maybe just is my opinion and just that. But I recommend you paint everything on this with dots and think about the wrinkles from the wood. So then will be always the same. Paint this stippling, but try to represent different kind of stipplings, different kind of results with these abstract ideas. And for sure, remember that these kind of stipplings will be completely different if you play with the temperature, if you play with the saturation of the color. For example, if you want to represent something like an old non-metallic metal, you want to represent something with scratches, with heats, something old. And you have to paint with a similar texture, not exactly the same texture, because could look like leather, but you can paint more or less the same. But the idea to represent something different between the leather and this non-metallic metal will be only the saturation from the color. Because if you want to represent the non-metallic metal, you should use a different saturation. If it's steel, you will play with grays, will be easy. But if you want to paint something like bronze, be careful, because sometimes this bronze could look too close to the leather, and then both materials will look the same, exactly the same. And it's the time when someone tells you that they can't understand the materials on your models because it looks exactly the same. So for that, to fix that idea, remember, if you have something with leather, you can play with something more saturated on the leather and something desaturated on the metallic. Just that. If you want to paint bronze, remember, something like more desaturated. If you want to play with orange or greens or yellows for gold, bronze, something like that, try to use them more desaturated. Just that. Something easy. And then if you use inks at the end of the result on your leather, you will create something completely different. This is the key. For example, on that armor, you will see that some areas looks more like leather and some of them more like non-metallics, because I created the roof or ceiling of everything. For example, if I know that I have to create a rivet, like non-metallic metal, on the leg, for example, you have to understand that the non-metallic metal part will have a highest contrast, the highest. So for that, you will decide or choose a highest ceiling closer to pure white, and the leather something between or in the middle with something lighter but not the same. It's a different technique to represent in the same area different materials, because as I said, you have the option to create a different finish only with inks or with a glossy varnish. But if you want paint exactly the same without inks because you don't like them, or because you want to keep the inks to another material, for example the wood, the idea will be paint with different contrast and different saturation, or for example add different nuances. And as for the hair, this is something really important. I wanted to keep more attention on the hair on this video tutorial, because I know some of you don't know well how to represent the hair, because it's something more organic. It's not like a hard surface. A hard surface like a cube, like an armor, like a sword, it's once time you understand them, it's super easy. It's clear to understand how works the light, how works the midtones, how works everything. If you want to represent something more polished, will be just blending more. If you want to represent something more rough, it's just create scratches, dots to represent this, something older. But what happens when you need to represent something organic like hair? The idea, this is a trick, okay? It's not real, but I think could be more interesting if you represent the hair on that way than if you represent in different way. For example, if you want to represent the hair, I recommend you paint the hair like a different non-metallic metal. As you heard well, the idea will be create this kind of contrast with a high contrast like a non-metallic metal, but with different ceiling. You have to decide a different cap for every color. You'll see after these minutes that I paint more layers and more layers, every layer lighter, because the idea will be paint with something very highlight. But never you have to forget that the ceiling for the non-metallic will be pure white. So you never have to paint with exactly pure white. So it's just keep some steps down and will be perfect. For example, something that you have to know about the hair. I recommend you search information on Google about hair. You have a lot of models, females and males, to see this. You will find something weird at the beginning, because after hearing my words, you will see something looks weird, like, okay, maybe this bride is unreal, but the truth works perfectly. So you have to understand or search this kind of photos, because some of these photos from models have Photoshop on them, and you will see perfectly the bride on the hair. For example, if you deconstruct the hair with volumes, the first volume that you have to know is the volume from the head. So if you paint a crown on the face, on the head, will be perfect to define that this is the volume. The hair is on the head. And then this is the easiest way. I recommend you start with this one. And then you have to represent everything like tufts. When I explain you on the tiger, on this animal, the saber tooth, but it's not exactly the same. You have to create like a saw teeth, okay, or shark teeth to represent on the top and the bottom of every brush stroke. To create this brush stroke, to create some information. Because if you paint a clean brush stroke, perfect clean on the top and the bottom, then will look like a wall. I don't know. Never will work as the hair. So you have to create these thin lines to represent the hair. But in the middle, in the body of every tuft, you have to create a solid tuft. And then with the next layers on that, you will paint with this technique. So you have to keep or paint with thin lines on the top and the bottom of every brush stroke. Only there. And you have to find or define every tuft. How? Again, you have to deconstruct everything with group of hairs. I know it will be hard to paint them or to find them. But if you want a trick, you can use the airbrush at least just to paint on the top or in the middle to represent some of them, and on the bottom to reinforce the shadows. This is just an easy sketch, just that, nothing else. Because I don't want to tell you that you have to paint on that way, because if you only paint with your airbrush, at the end you will have the highest lights on the top of the hair and then on the bottom the shadows, and will look exactly the same as other materials. And if you paint the hair with texture, at the end could look exactly the same like the leather or other stuff. If you see on the screen, you'll see that every layer will be lighter and lighter and lighter. Everything that you have to understand about this is if you paint with a low contrast, the hair will look like it's dirt, or maybe like another material, or like you didn't paint, just the base coat, nothing else. The most important or hardest part to represent the hair, it's defined on tufts. It's really hard to paint it. But once time you understand more or less the tricks, it's more or less similar, because it's something abstract, it's more organic. But I think on the hair you can have more license to create something different. Or for example, you can create a focus light where you need and change this idea about the non-metallic metal. If you see, I'm trying to represent this like a high contrast, but not exactly like a non-metallic metal, because if you paint exactly like a non-metallic metal, again, the result will look similar and will look weird if you have two different stuff, different materials, exactly the same. So I recommend you create something similar, but with not the same finish. And you'll see that in some areas I have more layers than in another. Why? I explain you. If you paint everything exactly with the same layers, for example 5 layers, at the end everything have exactly 5 layers. But sometimes if you paint with less layers, like 3 or 4, or maybe 2, will be more interesting than if you paint exactly everything with the same. Because at the end you will removing the midtones. Remember that? If you paint with more midtones, at the end will look more complex. The idea is more complex, more interesting. So you have to paint some areas with 2, 3 or 4 layers, okay? And then some of them with 5 or 6, for example. These 5 or 6 is to focus the attention on some areas, or because you want to create more light there. Like in that case, if you see the right side, you will see that I've painted with more layers or more light than the left. Why? It's only from the angle of this hair. And as you see, I continue adding light and light. Remember that this model I've painted to crystal brush, so I try to represent my best level. So I keep more and more and more attention than maybe in another model. It's just because sometimes something I've painted that maybe you can't see, just that. And this is one of my favorite part of this model. The way I painted this spear. Why? Because I painted exactly with the same trick as I used to the shoulder pads or the leather. But as you see, I started with an old brush, really thick, looks like flat brush. So it's really interesting to start. I enjoy painting on that way because it's like a canvas to me. So the sculpture was really flat without detail, and I decided to create a detail on that. And I create the spear like that with these thick brush strokes or stippling at the beginning, but then you will see how it changes everything. So you see, now it's the moment to keep your old brushes for another model. Maybe never you'll use them on the details, but to start some capibases at the beginning like that, with this kind of stippling, works perfectly. So I enjoy a lot painting like that, because I create something completely different than the sculpture. Something more neutral from the elf. I like it. And I think this kind of stippling, you will see perfectly the technique, and it's easy. It's just create straight lines with dots, thick dots. Just using a number 2, all number 2 will work perfectly. So it's just that. Some areas, as you see, I add more and more light, because the idea is to reinforce that areas. Some parts of the tree I want to represent with more light than the others, just that. And at the beginning I started with this kind of browns, but then I started to add some greens, maybe greens with browns, or maybe with more greens. But the idea is create these nuances on the wood. So I need to represent the spear from the forest. As you see, for example, now I'm painting aim better where I want to paint. Why? Because I want to focus more and more the texture. Add some information, but tiny information in some places. Not everything. If you paint everything on the same way, at the end looks exactly the same. So the idea is to represent something different and different. Always adding new information, you know? This is a canvas. This is to create a 4K model. You have to represent this with more and more layers, more information, more dots, more of everything. and you'll see like some areas have more depth than others. So this, it's like you have to build up this from the beginning, because some layers I kept the first base coat, the first copy base, and then I remove some of these areas, but then with the next layer I keep it. So this is the idea why I explain you that you have to remove or repaint the 90% of the previous layer, because it's the only way to build up everything with these different shadows, just to keep or to have different shadows, not everything with the same depth. So can you see how it changed everything? It's just having tiny touches. And as you see, I add different colors, more greens. And remember that this is only the beginning with the brush. Then we'll use the airbrush to paint everything again. At the end. So basically, this was everything on this video tutorial. I hope you have enjoyed watching this, because I explained you the different ways to create the texture. Remember that the finished is the most important part, so you can start at the beginning with the same color, or more or less the same color, with the same stippling, but the most important is at the end, the mid-tone, and the end, try to change everything to have a different finish. So this is the key to everything, and as you see, this is a way to enjoy painting. So I hope can continue seeing you in our Patreon, counting with your support, and I hope you can enjoy with these video tutorials, because someday, next day, you will paint like that or better. So thank you very much for your help. Bye bye!